Within popular culture, veterans of the Civil War are often depicted as having reconciled in reunions held throughout the nation in the late 19th century. Grainy images of blue and gray reunions often show grizzled veterans shaking hands, symbolically pulling the nation back together as the bitter memory of the Civil War faded. Yet how accurate is this portrayal? Join us today for a discussion with a former research fellow who has written a book that reveals why this often repeated tale of reunion and reconciliation fails to accurately capture how many remembered the Civil War, as we explore the pages of Kentucky history with Kentucky Chronicles. Hi, I'm Daniel J. Burge, the host of Kentucky Chronicles. I'm the associate editor of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, and I also coordinate our Research Fellows program, which brings in researchers from across the world to conduct research in the rich archival holdings of the Kentucky Historical Society. Dr. Carolyn Janney is a John L. Now III professor in history at the University of Virginia. She has published 8 books, as well as numerous articles and book chapters. Her most recent monograph, Ends of War, The Unfinished Fight of Lee's Army After Appomattox, won the 2022 Lincoln Prize. We're here to talk with her today about Remembering the Civil War, Reunion and the Limits of Reconciliation, published in 2013. Dr. Janney was a fellow at the Kentucky Historical Society in 2009 to 10 when she was researching Remembering the Civil War. This book would go on to win the Jefferson Davis Award from the American Civil War Museum and the Charles S. Sydnor Award from the Southern Historical Association. Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
I know it's been a while since you were researching here at KHS. I thoroughly enjoyed reading Remembering the Civil War and I'm quite excited to talk about it. I usually like to kick things off with a research question. I know you have published extensively over the last decade, but can you take us back to when you were working on Remembering the Civil War? Did you have a firm idea of what your monograph was going to be about, and how did it sort of come together?
So it's a great question, and I love talking about the research and the writing part of books. For that particular book, it's part of the Littlefield series that the University of North Carolina Press did that includes books such as Liz Varon's Disunion. It includes Bill Blair's book, With Malice Toward Some. The Littlefield books were meant to encapsulate and be a kind of a one-stop shop for 13 different pieces of the Civil War. So there's Thavolia Glimpse book, for example, was on the Women's War. And I was asked to write the book on memory. So I came to this project in a very different sort of way than one might usually come to a second book project. And I was actually asked to write it before my first book had even technically come out. So it was quite daunting to be asked to do what was to be both a synthesis and original research. So we had a topic, and I always tell my graduate students and my undergrads, you don't start with a topic, you start with a question. But in that particular instance, I had a topic to start with and try to find my way into how do I sum up and bring together all of the scholarship out there on Civil War memory to that point, but also offer something new. So it was a challenge to jump in, and the first place that I did research was at the Huntington Library, and I had a 3-month fellowship, which is a little slice of heaven to be out, especially when I was living in Indiana at that point, to be out during the winter months in Southern California. And I just went to the primary sources. I knew the historiographical questions. David Blight was, of course, center in mind, but my goal wasn't to dismantle Blight's argument. My goal was to try to bring together the scholarship and see what different sources, different angles, how that would change how we understood Civil War memory.
The Littlefield books always crack me up because they're so thick always. I feel like most of the entries are very, very large volumes, but the ones I've enjoyed working through some of those. So I personally really enjoy books that have a clear argument and that get right to the point, and you definitely did in yours. And I just want to give a brief quote. You write, "But contrary to popular notions, reconciliation was never the predominant memory of the war among its participants. Though hand-clasping veterans served as the chief symbol of a reunited and reconciled nation, deep bitterness and a refusal to cast aside judgments about the worthiness of the two causes remained throughout the lives of the generation that had survived the war. Before we delve into your argument, can you explain a bit about how reunion had been typically portrayed by folks like Ken Burns.
Sure. So the last episode of the Ken Burns documentary famously shows veterans at Gettysburg, both in 1913 and again in 1938, clasping hands over the famed stone wall. This notion that it was an easy peace, but it even goes back certainly much earlier than Ken Burns, thinking about ending the story of the war with Appomattox, of again a handshake being symbolic of Grant and Lee.
Right.
That it's a story, it's a feel-good story, that this cataclysmic civil war that was so devastating in so many ways, with the exception, of course, of emancipation, but the loss of life was tremendous. And yet the notion is that we came back together so peacefully. And yes, part of that story is true, but I kept coming across so much more bitterness and so much more resentment. And I didn't have to dig beneath the surface very far to find that.
What I was struck with, I think as I was working through the book, was how many personal examples you managed to find. I think the one thing that kept striking me as I was going through was, okay, here are these people, and you really get a sense reading the book how deeply it was still felt decades later. And I think that was one of those things that just as a reader kept striking me like, oh, it makes sense that if you live through this major event, it's not just going to, fly out of your mind and you're not just going to forget about it. But I think that's so deeply ingrained sort of in the popular culture.
Well, it's something we want to believe.
Mm-hmm.
It makes for a, it does play into that notion of American exceptionalism, that
Mm-hmm.
what other nation could go to war against itself and end stronger than it was before. Of course, that leaves out the race question
Mm-hmm.
completely, but it is a narrative, and people tell themselves stories for a reason. They tell themselves stories of reconciliation for a reason. They also told stories about the lost cause or the Union cause or the emancipationist cause for a reason. The way that memory is consciously and unconsciously used by the present generation, whatever generation that is, whether
Mm-hmm.
we're in the 1890s or we're in the 2020s, that there are psychological, emotional, cultural, social reasons that we describe the past as we do.
And the other thing I really enjoyed sort of building on that was how you didn't just end the story in 1898. I always feel like I get to the end of these sort of memory studies and it just gets to 1898 and I'm like, everyone comes together. And it's not necessarily that it's a happy moment in history because you're at war with Spain, but at the same time, it does sort of feel like from the American perspective, it's just, okay, we buried that in the past, we're all together. And at least for me as a reader, it's usually that's the end of the story right there. And we just sort of ended in 1898, 1900, and everyone's there.
Yeah, 1898 is in some ways just the beginning. The UDC is
Mm-hmm.
is fairly new at that point. So many of the memory wars are only beginning during that moment of the Spanish American War.
I really like that part because I was like, oh yeah, there's a lot more to this story, and that makes sense. So a lot of the book revolves around separating reconciliation from reunion. So for readers who might not be familiar with these two terms, or they might have some sort of broad notion of it, can you give us a really brief description of what you mean by reconciliation and reunion, and what sort of separates those two as a running theme throughout the book?
Sure. And this isn't something that I started the project with. It's something that I came to see through the primary sources. Reunion, what people meant by reunion, and sometimes they use the words interchangeably, but when we really dig down and look, reunion was a political fact. The Union was put back together. It was the goal of the Union war effort all along to bring those seceded states back into the fold. Reunion was a political reality, and we can debate whether it was a political reality in the spring of 1865 or 1868 or 1876, but it was a political reality. Reconciliation is harder to wrap your mind around in some ways because it's a sentiment, it's a feeling. I talk about it as a performance. Some of my favorite quotes in the book are some of the senators that have to go to these dedications, for example, at Chickamauga, Chattanooga, when the National Military Park is dedicated there in 1895. And There's a senator who says that he has to go do his part in the blue-gray gush. And it's not that he really feels this way, but he knows that this is part of the job. This is part of being a US senator. You have to go and shake hands with your former enemies, and it's a performance. So reconciliation could be a genuine forgiveness. It could also be showing up at Gettysburg in 1913 and posing for a photograph, and yet going back to your separate camps and having your own sentiments about what the war was about and what it all meant.
I think knowing your audience is very important for a lot of those. I think sometimes we don't separate, or at least I never separated that. Okay, yeah, it makes sense if you give a public speech and your audience might be of different persuasions, but that's going to be a lot different than if you go to Connecticut and you're giving a speech up in Connecticut, or if you're giving a speech in sort of the heart of New England. Yeah, it's going to be a lot different than what you might tell someone in Kentucky or in Tennessee who might, you could have people on both sides of that place.
Absolutely.
So in recent years, historians have focused quite a bit on the lost cause, but we tend to forget that others remembered the war differently. And this was one of the things I kept coming back through as I was working through the book. Within the North, sort of broadly defined, how did folks attempt to keep alive a different memory of the war? And who were these people who, as you put it, worked tirelessly to assure that the Union memory would neither be forgotten nor eclipsed by that of their former foes?
So the Union cause is the cause that Union soldiers, that those that are loyal on the home front, whether they fought in the war, whether they were men, women, black, white, those who believed that the triumph of the Union cause and the fight to preserve the Union and to ensure emancipation, that's what they believed the war had been about. Some of the dimensions of the Union cause change over time. I think over the course of time, the lost cause we'll talk, and we can delve into this a bit more if you'd like, but the notion of slavery changes in the lost cause, but it also changes within the Union cause, because the closer we get to the early 20th century, we start finding more and more white Union veterans talking about the fact that they not only saved the Union, they also emancipated the slaves. And that becomes an increasingly important part of their rhetoric, of their memory. But the Union cause is there from the beginning. It's what these men fought and died for. It's what their comrades died for. And they are indignant that rebels are going to try to tell a different story about what the war was about and why the United States was successful, why it was victorious. And so the more former Confederates start saying, oh, we were never defeated, we were simply overwhelmed by superior numbers and those hordes of immigrants and all sorts of other material that the North had, the Union cause pushes back. Union veterans push back. The more that Lee is glorified and Grant is denigrated, the more the Union cause pushes back. And so, led primarily by veterans and a little bit later by their women's groups, although their women's associations are never as central to the Union cause as will be the case in the former Confederacy with the lost cause. But there's a kind of call and response that's going on, where Union veterans are angry that former Confederates are saying one thing and former Confederates don't like what Union veterans are saying. And so there's this kind of tit for tat that generates and keeps it going, and it builds over time.
They have so many speeches that are just great throughout the book. Like, you hit on so many of those different ones where something would go down or someone would just give really salty language about a certain Jefferson Davis, or they would just, the amount of dislike and disdain that they have, you can feel it throughout the book.
The speeches are I think, they were rather an understudied part of memory studies, that looking at especially what Union veterans had to say, whether they were at GAR meetings or in their at monument dedications. For example, at Gettysburg, there'd be a day when all the Michigan monuments, regimental monuments, were dedicated. And that is such a rich vein to see what they're saying to one another, as opposed to what they're saying when they're speaking to a national audience of both Union and Confederate veterans and or their supporters.
I've always been struck when I've visited Civil War battlefields, the sheer number of states that built monuments that you don't really think about sometimes. I mean, I don't do the Civil War myself, but when I would go and you'd see Iowa, or you'd see Michigan, or you'd see, pick a state, and the sheer number of monuments they would put up at different places. I mean, we'd have fun just going to Shiloh and seeing what states were there and which ones had bothered to build a monument there. Or if you go to Gettysburg and you've got Southern ones, it's always interesting.
Yeah, the Shiloh battlefield is particularly beautiful, and that Iowa monument, if folks have not seen that, that's certainly one worth going to see.
They get very elaborate. It always just cracks me up when you're just like, oh, look, it's Iowa. And they're going all out there.
But that suggests how important
Mm-hmm.
the war and the memory of the war was, that when the states are willing to raise that money and to consecrate on that land something that was so pivotal. I mean, I think for so many people, the Civil War is a hobby, but
Mm-hmm.
these were people's lives, and they were the lives of their comrades and their brothers and their cousins and people in their communities. And so the gut level need to memorialize and remember people, I think it not only explains the Union monuments, it also explains the lost
Mm-hmm.
cause.
But I think you do a great job of sort of getting that back and forth that I think, at least for me, is often missing. So as this is a Kentucky history podcast, I always feel like the need to sort of ask this question. Is Kentucky unique in how it remembers the war? When you were here at KHS or sort of working on this project, was there anything that made Kentucky stand out? I know we all know it's a border state, but was there anything about it that was just interesting or that made it perhaps different than other states?
Well, I have to tip my hat to Anne Marshall first and foremost, because she has written the most important and the best book about Kentucky and the memory of the war. So I certainly tapped Anne's book quite a bit in thinking about the role that Kentucky played. Kentucky, famously, was it Merton Coulter who said that Kentucky became Confederate after the Civil War? Kentucky was always a Southern state, it was always a slaveholding state, but in terms of its Confederate identity, playing with that tension was a lot of fun, especially, I mean, the numbers speak for themselves. Overwhelmingly, men from Kentucky fought for the United States Army, whether those were the white men or the approximately 23,000 Black men who were enlisted in the USCT from Kentucky. I spent time looking at that tension, and in particular, when you asked me to do this podcast, I went back through my notes and went back to see all the things that I had looked at the KHS. And it was the Kentucky Orphans Brigade. There's a scrapbook that I spent a lot of time in, and scrapbooks are wonderful. They don't always have the dates of the newspaper clippings, but you can find so many little random bits and pieces that groups were thinking about. But I was really struck by the UDC records that are at the KHS and their struggle and their attempts to try to get Uncle Tom's Cabin banned in the state in the early 1900s. And they were successful in doing so. They got legislation passed that Uncle Tom's Cabin, the stage production, couldn't happen in the state of Kentucky. But it backfired because the legislation was premised on anything that would be race baiting, that would cause conflict between the races. That's how they described Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so African Americans pushed back and said, hey, look, Birth of a Nation does the same sort of thing. And so you can see the UDC's argument being used against them in many ways. And so that was one of the many treasures that I found at KHS.
Yeah, Kentucky is always just has an interesting role, but I've also sort of been struck, and I think if we have some researchers who are coming in to look more at individual counties who've put up monuments, but sort of the lack of more Union monuments over time and just how few there are, even though the first thing that people tell you as soon as you get here and you start researching Civil War is like more fight for the Union than the Confederacy. So it is an interesting dynamic that I think you see plowed in some border states, but it's also just interesting here.
Well, there was so much pushback against the Union veterans in the aftermath of the war that the Union monuments just didn't go up the way they did in places like Ohio and Indiana and elsewhere.
So I normally don't ask this question, but one of the things I think I should let our listeners know is I've been contacting folks who were here a while ago working on projects that they might have forgotten a little bit about. So when Dr. Janney was nice enough to come on the podcast, it's one of those, hey, do you remember this book that you worked on a few books ago now at this point? Do you mind? But I do like to sort of ask this question to those whose books have been out for a little while at this point. You won awards. It seems to have been well received. Do you feel like scholarship has been, and I know this is a hard question to answer, pushed in a new direction? Are there any sort of recent trends that you hope scholars working in Kentucky or elsewhere might be willing to sort of pick up and start to move these ideas in different directions?
Are you thinking about Civil War memory in particular, or
Civil War memory in particular is what I was thinking about.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that's happened, not just interesting, but a good thing that's happened is we've pushed the narrative farther into the 20th and even 21st century. Certainly recent events, most notably in 2020 with the horrific murder of George Floyd, brought the lost cause in particular into a new light. And those movements had been going on for some time, certainly as early as, 2015 is an important year because of the murders at the AME Church in Charleston. But even before that, there have been stories about pushing back against Confederate symbolism. But the literature, the historical scholarship has tried to follow that narrative. You talked about not stopping in 1898.
Yes.
I didn't want to stop in 1915 because that seemed like the 50th anniversary of the war was too neat of an end. I took it through Gone with the Wind, which to me was a pivotal moment. But people like Nina Silber have been pushing that story into the 1940s and 1950s, and we're certainly seeing some more scholars, some recent books, recent book by Andy Slapp and Hillary Green, a collection of essays that's bringing that story all the way up to the present. So I think that's one of the trends that we're seeing. Instead of just being a 19th century story, we're seeing how much memory is still very much with us and still very much changing and adapting as it's wont to do.
And each generation sort of has its own take, I feel like, on everything, in the sense of you have those veterans in your story who are there, and then as they're slowly moving off the scene, you see different groups come up, but they don't stop the story there. It doesn't just end. It just keeps on. Keeps on going. But that's also the challenge of research, I know, is you got to end the book at some point. So I know 1898 was a nice... Yeah, it's hard because I think most people will be like, oh, you can add another decade, or, you can do more than that. And then you sort of sit there and go, no, that's, I think, a good stopping point for us to get that book out there. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I know I enjoyed this chat, and I encourage our listeners to make sure they check out Remembering the Civil War.
Thank you so much.
Although it might be pleasant to imagine that veterans who wore the blue and gray simply reconciled after the war, history is rarely that simple. Bitterness remained and hardly faded with the passage of time. Northerners and Southerners alike continued to build monuments, write books, and debate why the war was fought, even as those who had experienced the war passed from the scene. The simple image of reunion and reconciliation fails to capture the complex story of how Americans remembered the Civil War. This brings another episode to a close. I'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Carolyn Janney, for talking with me today. Kentucky Chronicles is presented by the Kentucky Historical Society with support from the Kentucky Historical Society Foundation. Our show is recorded and edited by Gregory Hardison. Thanks to Dr. Stephanie Lang for her support and guidance. Our theme music is used courtesy of Pixabay. To learn more about our publication, the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, or to learn more about our Research Fellows program, please visit our website, history.ky.gov. If you have enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe. It really helps us to know how we are doing. You can also help us build a following by telling your friends to subscribe.